The Zercher squat versus the front squat. So three major differences to note between these exercises is number one, where your weight is going to be positioned when performing these squats. So in the Zercher squat, you're holding the weight closer to your center of mass. Now this is going to make this squat, I think, feel a little bit easier when it comes to achieving depth. And it's going to give you a little bit more of a hip dominant squat because with that weight closer to our center of mass, it's a little bit easier to kind of sit into the hole or even kind of sit back and achieve really good depth because we have a nice counterbalance. That weight being closer to the center of mass, I think, makes the Zercher squat a lot more accessible for a wider range of mobility needs and athletes and lifters. With the front squat, we have the weight in the front rack position. This is going to take the weight further from the center of mass. And so when it comes to hitting depth, you're going to be a little bit more quad and knee focused in the front squat to make sure you're clearing and hitting full depth while still having deep flexion while performing this exercise. And that's because I think for a lot of lifters, this weight is further from the center of mass. They need to have more knee and hip flexion in tandem with one another to achieve depth without having that bar pull them forward too much or lose that weight forward and having that torso collapse. Now in translation, what does this mean from the muscles we're going to be targeting with these exercises? That takes us into our second difference, which is with front squats, you are generally going to have a little bit more quad with this exercise. Because that weight is a little bit more forward, that is naturally going to pull a lot of lifters, I think, a little bit more forward with their balance and center of mass. So as they descend, they're going to be a little bit more heavy on the knee flexion and the quads. And now don't get me wrong, you're still going to get a ton of glute, you're still going to have a lot of posterior chain, a lot of adductor in the front squat, but because we have that weight in a front rack position further from center of mass, we'll generally get more quad when using front squats. Now with the Zercher squat, you're going to get a nice blend of different muscle groups. You'll have quads, you'll have glutes, and you'll have adductors. Those are going to be your prime movers in the Zercher squat. And I think if you're trying to balance all the muscles you're hitting, the Zercher squat can be an awesome option to go with because you will generally have to modify it a little bit less. For example, in the front squat, you may need to wear weightlifting shoes or elevate the heels to make sure you're able to hit depth without losing that weight forward, especially if your front rack is a little bit weaker or if you just don't have the mobility. Whereas in the Zercher squat, you can kind of get away with using an elevated heel or even a flatter shoe, and you could typically achieve depth without many issues. I often equate the Zercher squat as a leveled up goblet squat. The goblet squat, we're holding the weight in a slightly lower position. It's a little bit easier to move the arms. Similar to the Zercher squat, we kind of have a similar position here. The bar is just sitting at the elbow crease being a little bit lower. So they're both kind of similar in the sense that they're very easy to modify for a lot of different lifters to get full range of motion in the squat, which is going to be very heavy on the glute, adductor, and quad. Now I do want to talk about the torso and what muscles you'll typically feel worked when doing Zercher squats and front squats. In general, if you're new to front squats, I would say expect your mid back and upper back to likely feel a little bit sore, especially if you do get heavier and you notice that you're starting to dip until you really build that really solid front rack position where you can keep better balance. That is likely going to be an area because with that weight further away, you will naturally have a little bit more flexion or at least have to fight that flexion of the torso to make sure your elbows stay high and you can really control that weight without it trapping and pulling you down. In the Zercher squat, you might feel a little bit more mid back just because that weight is sitting lower, and as you get heavier, you might start having the hips come up a little bit more and then having your torso lag, but in general, it will be a little bit less. And oftentimes you're likely not going to feel the lower back a ton either if you're able to maintain a more upright position and you're able to maintain a nice strong Zercher position. Now the third major difference to note between these exercises is when you'd want to use them. So with the front squat, if you are a weightlifter or if you are a CrossFit athlete, they can be an awesome squat variation to implement into your training because a lot of your sport will be dictated by having a good front rack and strength in a front squat. For example, if you're doing a WOD and you have cleans or if you have thrusters, being really strong in the front squat and really having your form dialed can be really useful. And then obviously for weightlifting, you are going to be catching cleans. That is one of your main lifts. Being good in a front squat and having a really good front rack position will be good for your goals. Now the Zercher squat, I feel like, is one of those squat variations that can transcend pretty much all lifters and athletes. They can be fantastic, I think, to do for most lifters and athletes. If you're trying to limit your spinal loading and you don't want to necessarily go with front squats after back squats, I think the Zercher squat can be an awesome variation to do. It'll give your back, I think, a little bit of a break, and it'll allow you to work through deeper ranges of motion a little bit easier, in my opinion, than the back squat and front squat because there's a lower bar to entry. Granted, it will be a little bit uncomfortable, sure, in the elbow creases, and I have tips for that, like using a squat pad or putting your knee sleeves on your arms. But in general, the Zercher squat can be a really good do-it-all squat variation for tackling a lot of different goals, including strength, hypertrophy, and just working through deeper ranges of motion, whereas the front squat can be fantastic for sport-focused athletes, and then also athletes who do want a little bit more quad in their squat and might not want to necessarily back squat for a block or two. All right, so now let's quickly go over when you should use each. So with the front squat, I think that could be an awesome variation to explore when you need a break from back squatting, or when you are starting to get into CrossFit or weightlifting more seriously. For the Zercher squat, I think they could be great for pretty much every level of lifter, and they've honestly become one of my defaults for newer lifters who are trying to get into heavier squats, but don't necessarily have the front rack position right away for the front squat, or have the mobility, mechanics, or anatomy for back squats, or if they just feel weird in them. Oftentimes, the Zercher squat will also be preferred by my clients who typically have knee issues, and this also includes myself, because I'm constantly battling cranky knees as well, but I think because where the weight is positioned, being close to the body and being a little bit easier to manipulate positions and ranges of motion, the Zercher squat can be a good option there for pretty much, again, everybody, but then also lifters who are kind of working around uncomfortable knees. Whereas opposed if you're front squatting and you do have a little bit more cranky knees, you might have a little bit more gray area there because of the heavier knee flexion with your knees and how they feel. But that will definitely be something individual that you'll want to explore on a case-by-case basis. All right, guys, that wraps up this video breaking down the Zercher squat versus the front squat and talking about some of their differences and when to use each. I love both of these squat variations, and I think there's merit in really conquering and nailing both of them. The Zercher squat has become one of my absolute favorite squat variations outside of the Hatfield for giving me a lot of bang for my buck and also keeping me feeling relatively fresh and working through deeper ranges of motion. But the front squat is also fantastic for giving me a nice carryover to my CrossFit focused performance. If you have additional questions on either of these squats, or if you need guides, I have filmed videos on those. Definitely check those out on the channel, or drop a comment down below if you have questions on this video. But as always, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.